Welcome to Sex Talks with Diana, a space where, from sex work to tantra, we tap into raw experiences to uncover how they intersect with sex and sexuality. Because knowledge not only lives in books, we listen to people in their stories. Let's dive in. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking with Sister Shannon. She helps Catholics, in her own words, reintegrate their bodies and create spiritual, religious, divinity-connecting practices based on their pleasure and the world they want to live in. So, hi, Shannon. I'm so excited to have you here. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. It's so nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as you all know, in December last year, 2021, we were talking about sex and religion. And we thought it could be, we have some changes this year and we're dropping our monthly themes. So right now we're starting to explore everything that we can and that, life brings on our way. So right now we're going to be talking in the framework of talking about sex and religion and how they coexist and correlate. Well, the first question I want to ask you, because if you all scroll through Shannon's page, you're going to see that she uses a lot the term Catholix with X at the end. So I'd like to know, what does that mean?
Yes, that's a great question. So when I first started the page a year ago, it was called Catholics Who Have Sex, spelled like the way most people would spell Catholics, CS. Mm-hmm. And a few months into it, I realized there are 1.3 billion people who call themselves Catholic across the globe, and every one of them has a kind of different definition of what it means to be Catholic. And so as I was naming things on the page and figuring out what language I wanted to use in my work, it became really necessary for me to create some way to differentiate that when people see the term Catholics in my work, it does not necessarily have anything to do with what we traditionally think of as a dogma, doctrine-focused Catholicism. And so while I know the language of Catholicism will still resonate for people, it was important for me to have a way visually to kind of demarcate it and make it different so that people could understand themselves in sort of a different definition of Catholicism, if that makes sense. And so I added the X a few months in because it provided me a more expansive way to think about Catholicism beyond just the doctrine and the dogma of the patriarchy.
Okay, that sounds cool. So I'd like to ask you there, because then what is it that it is different from this way? You just kind of started saying it already. What's different from this way of what's different about this way of conceiving Catholicism?
It allows people to hold on to their Catholic language, but creates enough of a differentiator to not feel like Catholics CS is the way other people understand them. For example, when I talk about myself in the Catholics community with an X, that creates space for gender fluidity. It creates space for sexual orientation fluidity. It creates more space for more other pieces of identity to fit within the Catholic language. And I think that's important.
Certainly. Yeah, that actually takes me to one of the questions I have here that I'd like to ask you, which is, do you think that being religious or practicing a certain faith and being sex positive, can coexist peacefully in the same person, in the same worldview?
Yes. And the reason I say yes is because I do. So I am my own verification on this. But when people think about religion, so the word religion, the root of it just means to rebind, to reconnect to spirit, to God. But people don't often get that clarity on it. So especially in Catholicism, we associate it a lot with dogma, doctrine, hierarchy, things that aren't necessarily spirit related, but power seeking related. And so language is a helpful way to consider how things like religion can coexist with sexuality. We know there are other religions across the world where the two things go along just fine. Yeah. And so it can exist in other cultures and in other religions. Catholicism doesn't need to be left out of that. It's just that it has for a number of historical reasons for centuries.
Okay. I'd like to explore that, but I think I'd like to start exploring that part by getting a little bit personal, if you're okay with that. And, you can share as much as you feel compelled to do it. But I would like to know, because there has to be a lot behind your project, and probably it has to do with you, right? So my question is, were you raised Catholic, or are you Catholic? And then how does being raised Catholic or practicing the faith affect your sexuality and your concept of yourself as a sexual being?
Yes. So I am raised Catholic. People would use the term cradle Catholic for me. My family's Catholic. We went to church every weekend growing up. So Catholicism for me is a very family-based thing. I know I did not go to Catholic school, for example. That's another way to relate to Catholicism. But for me, it was very family-based, very in the home. And that was kind of the basis for it. So when, as I was growing up, as I was leaving the house, I got pregnant, not married. That created a lot of strife for the family initially. Some of that is based in Catholicism, but a lot of it is really based in family fear and family expectations. If we want to pin Catholicism as the driver of that, we maybe can, but it became a lot clearer to me through that process of having my child, how much of it was really family expectations compared to maybe what the Catholicism line would have been about it.
Okay. How did this impact really the way you see yourself as a sexual being? Like, did it really have a direct impact, or like maybe it didn't, maybe?
Yeah. So I grew up with, I think, similar to many people, not just in Catholicism, but across, the United States. We didn't grow up with great sex ed, and we grew up with a lot of shame around it. So while I'm a very physical being, I'm a dancer. I'll say my body just moves differently throughout the day than compared to a lot of my family. I'm a very in my body kind of person. And that translated over into my sexuality for sure, because I trust my body. I feel comfortable in my body, and I also have sex. So growing up, when you're not given a lot of medically accurate, shame-free sexual education, that leads a lot of us to explore our sexuality on our own without a lot of support, which I was certainly in. So the Catholicism piece of my sexuality wasn't really an impact for me when I first became active, because it was kind of a separate, at that time, I kept my sexuality and my faith separate. Okay. It wasn't until a number of years later, when I had a child and when more family conversations came up, because my parents finally had to figure out that I was sexually active, that I needed to reclaim the Catholicism piece of it, because it was a thing that kept getting brought up in family pieces. It was hard at the time to work through, but I'm grateful that I've been able to go through that, because now I have a sexuality and spirituality that support each other instead of just keeping them disconnected, which is what many Catholics who are sexual tend to do. They're kind of one person most hours out of the week. And if they go to church on Sunday, they're just a separate person on Sunday morning, which can be hard because it's splitting yourself up and it's making you kind of into two different people. So
yeah, it's very important. And actually, that makes me want to ask you this question, because I think it fits right now in what you just said. Since you're so close to like this line of work and this type of dichotomy within people, I'd like to ask you, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to keep practicing their faith or their belief system, but they feel that it maybe enters in conflict with their sexuality?
The first thing I would suggest is pay attention to how the pieces of your faith tradition land in your body, especially with something like Catholicism that is thousands of years old and has lots of different pieces up to it. Some things might sit really well and feel really good in your body, and that's good and that's holy and that's fine. And also some parts of it will not feel good. And so the first thing I would suggest is people pay attention. If, for example, if you're going to mass, there are some prayers that might not sit well in your body if you pay attention to it, but you might love the singing, or you might love the stained glass windows in the sunlight there. And just getting clear on which pieces serve you and kind of fill you up and make you feel connected to God, and which pieces make you feel shame or make you feel guilt that isn't yours, and letting those pieces go. Because Catholicism is a religion that has lots of different experiences piled on top of it, that all exist for a specific reason, but we're not taught the reasons that many of those things came into existence. And so then we think we're just supposed to take all of it. And it's a lot to hold because it's a lot of people and experiences to put on top of ourselves. So getting really clear with your body about what feels good and what doesn't is the first step.
That's interesting. It'll be like a mindful type of approach to it. Listen to your body, see how it responds. And then you mentioned there that there can be some guilt and shame that arises that is not yours.
Right.
What do you mean by that? Like whose is it then?
Yes. No, great question. So, I was once speaking with a friend who was raised Episcopalian, and she said something that was really interesting to me because I just kind of asked her, like, can you explain what Episcopalianism is? And she said, Shannon, it's basically Catholicism without the guilt. And it's a little bit hard to hear if you're in Catholicism because as someone, she's not in that space, but to hear someone else reflect that back to you, it makes you a lot clearer on how much guilt and shame you're sitting in as part of just the ecosystem you're in. And it's hard to notice it since you've been in it, since I've been in it my whole life. But to have someone else reflect it back to me, it made me pay a lot more attention to when do I feel guilty and when is it not actually mine. So, for example, one of the prayers that often gets said at the beginning of Mass is a prayer that starts with like begging God for forgiveness for your sins and basically saying, I'm a sucky person. God, please forgive me. There's nothing I can do about it. And prayers like that, when they're not clear on what you're asking for forgiveness for, can really seep into your whole mindset because then you're kind of just apologizing for being who you are. And that's not respectful to you. That's not respectful to the community around you because it seeps in this idea that you were never worthy of belonging to God in the first place. And that's really hard because you want to feel connected to a higher power. You want to feel connected to a creator. But if you're telling yourself that you're just a screw up the whole time, it makes it really hard to even feel worthy of saying, hey, God, I need help, or hey, God, what the heck's going on here? And so there's a lot of shame. One of the people I work with talks a lot about it as Catholic shame. And I think that's helpful phrasing because guilt typically implies that there's a specific thing you feel guilt about. But shame is just kind of this world that you just live in. And as long as that shame is sitting in your body, it's going to continue to not feel good because it's hard to move from a place of shame.
Totally. That is very, very important as well, because I like how you mentioned that feeling of, because I think if I can share personally, I'm not a religious person, but for a lot of time, my parents were first Catholic and then they became like kind of a different branch of like Christian people. So I went to a different church. And for a lot of years, I went to that church and there's this thing which right now there is zero element of that in my life. I do consider myself to be a spiritual person in other aspects, but not specifically when it comes to relating to God directly. Like I don't think of myself like talking to God or, relating to God in any way, maybe to everything else like that's around me, the trees, animals, everything else that's out there. But I don't really think of God as, I don't think of God in my life usually, and let alone connecting to God, right? But I do think that it's interesting how that element gets out of because for very, very specific reasons that came out of my life. Because to me, it was like, this doesn't serve me. And it was very similar to what you just mentioned about how, you kind of start feeling there is this narrative around certain things that make you feel like you don't belong and you're trying so hard to fit in.
Right.
And just as a human. So I think that's very important, because I could be an example. I'm not sure. I don't know if I had a close relationship to God, maybe I could feel better with myself or with the world or with what happens with me, or maybe I would be better able to handle things. We don't know. Um, but I was certainly like, this possibility is kind of already, let's say, out of my life because of this precisely. um, and I think, personal opinion, religions have a potential. Religions in any, practice and faith, has a potential to really actually allow you to live life to the fullest and become your best self. If you actually, if you connect it, as you just said, connect it to yourself, see how your body reacts. Um, so I think it's interesting. I'd like to know, what do you think is the, well, probably we've talked about it, but maybe you have more ideas. What is the counter narrative to what you just mentioned? So there is this narrative of, God forgive me, because I have sinned. Then there is this understanding that you just are because you are human. So what's the opposite, or how do we rewrite that so that we can still, maybe
Yeah.
ask for that forgiveness without feeling like we don't
Yeah.
belong, like we don't fit in?
Right. Oh, wow. What is the contra narrative? So I'll start with the body. And specifically people who have been born with clitorises or sexual anatomy that allows them pleasure.
Very
For
well
anyone
phrased.
who, sorry?
Very well phrased.
Right. For anyone who was given anatomy whose sole purpose is to feel good, for those of us with some connection to a thing we call God or some higher being, God did not do that on accident. It is not an accident that people can orgasm. It's an inconvenience for a church that's tied in with economic power structures that it's trying to maintain. But for those of us who have a body part that just allows pleasure, that's all the proof I need to say that God wants me to feel good. God wants good things in my life. I am allowed to feel good about them, and I don't have to apologize every time I feel good. I start with the body because those are the physical facts in front of me. Yes, that's where I start. That's my counter narrative.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm asking from your experience because and then there is another question I had, because I saw that, so I've been like checking on you for a while and looking at your page and stuff. And I noticed that, I think fairly recently, in your bio, you changed something and you added the ex-Catholic coach.
Mm-hmm.
So what does this mean? Does it mean that you don't practice the faith anymore, or what does it mean?
So there's a couple parts to that. One, I didn't want it to just say Catholic coach, because part of what happens on Instagram is, if you go, just the way that particular line works on Instagram, if people go looking for religious trauma or Catholic and coach in the same line, I want it to be very clear up front that I am not the person who's going to try to convince anyone to stay in Catholicism. That's not what my work is for. God, for us, is bigger than Catholicism. I don't care if you stay in it or not. I also know there's a significant number of people in Catholicism who leave the church or call themselves ex-Catholic, whether they call themselves ex-Catholic forever or feel like that for a while and then come back, or just get rid of all the language that they can. Having that in the bio helps me and people who end up following the page get clear on there's space for all of us in this page. There's space for all of us who were raised in Catholicism or have been impacted by it, because regardless of how we call ourselves, when people are asking what our religion is, Catholicism has impacted our brains and it's impacted our mindsets. And so that the page exists to help people work through the mindsets that don't work for us anymore, that are keeping us from really living into our full pleasure and our full purpose, in this particular space and time that we live in. And so just having that language on the page helps the community stay aware that this is not a Catholic front to try to pull people back in, but it's a space for everybody.
That's nice. That's really nice. I would also like to explore, because one thing that happened last year when we talked about religions is that we talked about them we try to be very neutral about them. So what we did was we mentioned, like the main milestones of each in terms of sexuality, marriage and the way they conceive it and other things. But I think it's important to also acknowledge where these religions sit in terms of power structures. And this is like a very large topic to dive into. But I would like to know your thoughts, and because I know, and it's sad that most of the cases, at least that we hear of, the main religions that people tend to practice in the Western part of the world, when people try to connect them with sexuality, it's usually with a bad outcome. So, and then there are these places where people go to, maybe cults, and even, like certain things happen in childhood sometimes. And I'd like to know, like, what do you think of that? I I don't know if the question is who is to blame for this, or how can we, what is it that we need to change for these things not to happen? Spaces where you're tend to, instead of go and experience religion in a way that's going to allow you to live in your pleasure and fulfill yourself, it ends up doing the opposite for you.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, this was maybe a month or two ago. I posted some posts that I put on my page, and someone came back and commented, I think directed at me, sounds like someone's trying to start a cult. And all I could do was laugh, because I have just lots of like lines that I think are hilarious that just go through my brain. I don't say many of them out loud, but the line that went through my head was, honey, we're exiting a cult. It's called being female in Catholicism.
Yep.
And so that's the first thing that came to my mind. But I think so at a base level, what I'm looking for is safety in my body. And so I say this as someone who has a very sensitive nervous system, who I face a lot of anxiety whenever something comes up. It is a way that spirit works through me. So for example, one of the reasons I talk about sex and relationships so much is because if I have a crush on somebody, I have to tell them, because otherwise I will not sleep or eat. That is just what happens in my body. And so that used to freak me out, because I grew up in a space where telling someone you liked them was supposed to be this really big deal. At the age of 28, I have worked through it enough times to be like, no, my job is just to say what I'm feeling. It's not my job to control how that person responds. My job is just to say, this is the energy I'm sitting with, and I need to move it through my body. Thank you for hearing me. And that is what allows me to recenter and sleep well at night. So I think when people go, from religion to religion, or from one thing to another, we're jumping, and Catholicism's right in here on this, but Catholicism has been I use the word traumatic a lot. I'm not a therapist. I'm not the person who's going to get into all of what that lingo means, but words have impact. And so I use the word trauma with it, because it's important for people in Catholicism to realize that we have been traumatized by that religion. And so some of our responses might not actually be the healthiest thing for us long term, but there's a reason that we jump maybe from Catholicism to something else that looks kind of culty, or some other sort of coping mechanism. And as long as we are kind of just jumping from one thing to another, instead of taking a look at what we just went through, taking a look at what we were raised in, pulling out the pieces of it that were good, because they are there if people want to find them, and also taking out the stuff that did not work for us, we're going to continue to jump to other things that don't actually fulfill us at a safety level, because we're not going to understand that we are our own safety, that we create our safety, we create the communities that keep us safe. And as long as we don't get that, we're going to keep jumping around. But that's why, I talk about economic safety and economic justice, because as much as Catholicism wants to think it has this big thing in our brains, the reality is for many of us, we're just living in an economic system that requires us to work 40 or 50 hours a week to pay rent because we live in a world of property rights. And Catholicism is tied up in that because Catholicism was part of the Western Empire for centuries. But these are all pieces of Catholicism that Catholics today don't learn about because it's not what the Catholic Church wants to teach us. And this is why this work is so important, because there's so many layers to unpack as we get back in touch with our own bodies and stop projecting our trauma onto other people. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think we went slightly in a different direction. Historically, you're starting to mention the historical reasons of like why certain, or well, at least the impacts that Catholicism has had. And I think you just said that it's important that people learn these things. Yeah. And I guess I'd like to ask you why. Like, what do you think is the impact on people and communities to learn this history and this part of Catholicism?
Yeah. Because it contextualizes it. It makes us realize that Catholicism it's not just this divine, untouched religion handed down to a select few of us by God. That's kind of how the church wants us to think it is. But for example, I learned about the doctrine of discovery like a year and a half ago. And that, for people who aren't familiar, is a document signed by the Pope back in the 1400s, basically okaying colonization of the Western Hemisphere. So Catholicism's deep in this. And when I emailed my parish priest, kind of tongue in cheek, but I emailed him and said, why don't we teach Catholics this? Because this is important information for us to understand as we walk around trying to defend a church that's actually been kind of shitty for a lot of people. This would be helpful context. And his response was almost laughable. I mean, it's fine. But he was like, yeah, Catholicism helped like extend civilization to the rest of the world. And I was like,
oh my God.
Sir, you don't understand. You don't understand. So there are Catholics who think Catholicism is like the only true religion, even though Jesus himself wasn't Catholic. And then there are people born in Catholicism who have probably been through some other experiences that have lent them to having a more critical approach of what they were raised in, whether they're a white person living in an incredibly racist society and they're white people trying to figure out what the hell their ancestors were doing that contributed to this mess. And that's just my own personal experience. So that's what I'm speaking to. But there are people who need to understand these things, because when you learn the history, then you can release it from your psyche. You can claim it for yourself, or you can say that was shit and we should never have done that, and how do we repair? But as long as you ignore that history, then you ignore the possibilities that you have for redressing it for the communities that need the redressing. And that's why learning the history is important.
Yeah, totally agree. I was about to ask you that if you think that learning these things can help bring accountability to all these things that have happened for so many years. And I also think that it would serve us, because another thing that happened with the whole colonization process is that a lot of knowledge was lost too, because these people, just so you know, I'm based in Colombia. So like the people who were here in this part of the world, the indigenous peoples with their traditions and with their things, they also had a lot of knowledge that we could, like, I personally believe if society had those bits of knowledge and used them in their everyday life, everybody in society, in the world, probably our systems wouldn't be so oppressive sometimes, and they wouldn't harm the way they do. So I love that idea that if you're going to be Catholic, you should learn about this too. Because, yeah, I think it's not a matter of like pretending it never happened.
Right.
It's even worse if you want to pretend that it's okay that it happened. I think what needs to happen is that we say that it happened, but then how do we not make it happen again? How do we stop it from happening? How do we, as you said, repair? And I think that is very important. And that brings me to a specific aspect that I would like to ask you about, which is, um, I guess one word I could use to talk about this would be like womanhood and
Mhm.
also motherhood. And in general terms, like the role of women or females in society, and also the role of non-binary people in general, because there is something also there that has happened historically with the church in general and in some religions. So yeah.
So speaking to my experience, you mean?
Sure, yeah.
So I will say that was this is an interesting topic because it's only in the last probably 8 years or so that I really took on an understanding of myself as someone who identifies with the language of woman and feminine. And even in that understanding and kind of claiming of it, also understands this is not the end all be all, but what we operate in is this. In the Western world, we've got this language of like this masculine feminine split.
Yep.
That's the language that we have right now. That language is evolving, and there's lots of people who can help us move beyond that. As someone who does not identify as non-binary, I'm not going to try to speak to that. What I do speak to is so I use the phrasing of divine feminine a lot in my own consciousness and in my own work, because it wasn't until that language really came to my attention that I understood for me just how demonized anything feminine had been. Okay. So it was really very, I don't know, it helped me really reclaim the parts of me that are stereotypically feminine, soft, mothering, compassionate, open. These are all parts of me that I work with on a daily basis that I enjoy. And so to be able to reclaim the feminine as something sacred and as something holy was really helpful for me. Again, that is not the end all be all of the work we need to do with gendered language, but because that's what my identification is at this point, it was very helpful for me from a reclaiming standpoint. What else was your question?
It goes on the side of because it says there had to be some reclaiming, right? So you need to reclaim these parts of yourself, but why we're not there? Why did you need to reclaim them? What happened? Like, and does Catholicism have anything to do? A little bit, nothing. What happened there?
So this is a thing that I know. I thought I had a lot of male friends in high school, and I know this. I know there was a part of me, just a little thing in the back of my brain that was like, there was something that fed my ego about, oh, I don't have lots of friends who are women or girls. That was a thing in my brain. It doesn't mean I didn't have any. It doesn't mean I was rude to anybody, but that was a thing that sat in my brain. And where did that come from? This is why the socialization piece is so important to look at, because even as someone who's very pro-woman, pro-trans, pro-non-binary, I still have these mindsets that would be antagonizing to myself. So I have to look hard at that language and figure out why I would be judging myself if I were anybody else. And I think even in, I'm not saying that I'm going to use divine feminine language forever. I think there is a journey of language, and I think we take on things as they help us and learn how to let them go as they don't anymore. But reclaiming feminine and appreciating the women, the people who have vulvas, the people who have been feminine, who have been socialized as female, really helped me reclaim a lot of the beauty in myself. And that helped my nervous system. That helped me center a lot more in who I was born as and who I'm here to be. And that's been my journey. And it's allowed me to not put so much judgment or put so much of my own projections on everyone else, because I now understand that it's just we're reclaiming the pieces we need to make ourselves whole again. Because Catholicism has put us in a space where we don't think we're whole, and we don't think we ever will be, because apparently we're sinners until the day we die. And thank God, God forgave us.
And do you think there is a specific way that goes, a specific road it goes down when it comes to women specifically, understanding women I guess, as like probably is mostly understood in the binary in there. Do you think there is a specific
within Catholicism?
Yeah, because you just mentioned that you're starting to that you said we are starting to reclaim these pieces so we can become whole, because Catholicism told us we're not, worthy. Do you think there is a specific narrative that applies to women specifically within that bigger narrative of I'm a sinner, I'm not enough?
Yes. So I'll say this from my own experience with the church that I've attended for a while, and it's a Catholic parish, but I'll attend, they'll have scripture studies once a week that I will sometimes go to. And it's really interesting watching the women in those spaces, because 9 times out of 10, it's the women saying things or having critiques or having like pushback on some of what we're coming up with. So I see it all the time. Women in Catholicism have lots to say, have lots of opinions, and have a very felt sense that the whole story has not been told in the Bible because it's so male focused and uses such male language for God. But then I go to these spaces where Catholic women aren't necessarily structurally kept out of saying anything, and we're the ones who have things to say. And I think that's a really helpful reclaiming space for us, because it allows us to see each other and acknowledge each other, and the men take a back seat for a little bit. And it's not that men are bad or that we don't want them there, but when you look at who's been pushed out of the spaces of power, it makes a lot of sense that the women are the ones saying the most things and showing up at these meetings to say these things.
Yeah, it's important. That's very important. Because and I have also heard of, like, and again, this is probably not within the framework of Catholicism, but it probably is within the framework of religion, or maybe Christianity. I have a friend that it's very interesting, because for me, I am 22, I think. So for me, it's normal to have a lot of friends, and for people my age not to be religious at all. Mm-hmm. And that's normal, and that's fine. But she holds on to a certain, not religion, but like a belief or this practice, right? Mm-hmm. And she believes in it, and it's the one that her family has. But she has this very critical way of seeing things. So she still practices, and she, for example, has made the choice of waiting until marriage to have sex. Mm-hmm. And it's her choice, and she tells me it's my choice. Nobody's forcing me into this. Even though, like, this is what they prefer, I don't do it for them. I do it for me. This is my choice. And I find that very interesting. And one day she was telling me how, because her sister is in this sort of not that much of a good relationship, but she's married and has kids. And they are both, all of them, go to this church and all this. And they hold also some meetings in there. And then she tells me it was very weird for me to see how they would tell women, basically, they will send them the message that they have to just allow their husbands to do whatever they're doing. And, and if if they're doing something that's hurting them, something that's not okay, and that being said, like maybe you're lying, or maybe not saying, good words and things like this that damage any type of relationship, not just romantic relationships. They would be kind of instructed almost to just like not do anything, and instead be like very supportive, and like instead think, oh, maybe he had a bad day, or maybe, whatever. And like there is not this space to tell women, or for them to think of their worth in that dynamic, and I think that's also very important, because while religions and all these practices are important, I think those things shouldn't be happening anywhere. Like no human being should be put, under any other just because anything. So that's also something important when talking about religion, I believe, which is, this can happen. And it's not only that it can happen, I think, as you've mentioned, as females, women are reclaiming certain spaces. I think it's not only certain religions or religious scenarios. It's been in the world in general, the Western world, and in all the modernization and all the European ideas that women actually ended up having this place below men at some point.
Right.
Um, so yeah. So I don't know if I guess like a cool question to ask could also be if you think there is anything that, or you've seen it because you've mentioned it a little bit, um, that religions or maybe churches or the places that you maybe are more close to can do to actually, like actually give women back these things.
Yeah.
Like, is there anything that they could be doing differently or better?
Yeah, I mean, let's go big. Catholicism should not have, like, we decide who our priests are based on their genitalia. That's the fact of the matter. No one says it that way, but like, that's what we base it on. So the main thing is we need to stop genderizing the roles. All of that said, it's interesting, people, at least in the US, and the US is very US centric, right? So like we don't think about people beyond the national borders very often, but Catholicism has 1.3 billion people and it's a worldwide religion. You do not get to be an organization of that size without allowing a vast amount of differentiation in how people want to do it. That's just how the organization growth works. The Vatican doesn't tell us this because it helps them for us to kind of stay in our lanes, but people are practicing Catholicism in very different ways across the world. So, and parish to parish, a lot of people stay in a parish because of a priest specifically. And if the priest moves, sometimes they'll go with him. And so that should already tell us that something about the independent relationships that build the connections to God, not the Catholic Church itself all the time. The first thing that Catholic parishes and Catholic churches need to make sure their members understand is that every parish is different. Every parish has its own culture, way of doing things. There are Roman Catholic women priests who have all been excommunicated by the Vatican, but these things already exist. And if people feel called, people need to move towards God the way they feel moved towards God. And it's not anyone's job to keep, barriers around those things. So if women want to be priests, women need to know that's an option for them. That's number one. If men want to be nuns, they also need to know that's an option for them. But because so much of what we see doesn't get critiqued, and we don't have a lot of space in Catholicism to critique it on our own, those conversations just don't happen. But I've been at parishes that had very active LGBTQ groups. And then I've been at parishes that have had transphobic stuff put up on their walls. So the array exists. And it's making sure people understand that the array exists and that there are options for them in the space if they want to find them. And if they don't, that's okay too.
I like that. because I think it's not about abandoning something completely and having to like redo yourself from the beginning. Right. It's a matter of like of finding. I like that, because it gives a message of like find the right space. And if we connect this with what you said before, listen to your body and then go find the right space for you. But that doesn't mean that you need to stop believing the things you believe and practicing and doing things that you like to do.
And it doesn't mean that it's not a process. So one of the problems with Catholicism is because if people have a divine connection to God and they felt it in Catholic ways, it can be terrifying to think, oh my God, I can't be Catholic anymore, but I don't know other ways to connect to God. So I'm going to still stay here because these are all the tools that I've been given. But if people start to understand their bodies as a source of wisdom, nature as a source of wisdom, St. Francis is very helpful for a lot of Catholics because he's someone who saw God, I think similar to maybe what you were talking about. He said, like, brother, sun, and sister moon. Like he saw God in nature. He
Beautiful.
saw God through his day to day. That's a very helpful space for a lot of Catholics because it helps us expand our connections to God beyond the hour of Mass every week.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And then, so what do you think for people who are going through this process? Because certainly there must be a lot of people, maybe even among listeners, who are Catholic or religious or practicing on any specific faith. And they're in this journey of like maybe trying to find a better place to be in that religion. For you, maybe you can choose to answer this from your perspective or from what you've seen and you think happens. But what do you think is the process, or what do you think they should expect? Because sometimes, with unlearning or with these changes, people might encounter certain challenges and things that might be difficult to handle. So what would you say the process is, or what things can happen within you and change and challenge you?
What's coming for me right now, the first thing I would do is if you have a question, ask somebody you trust or write it down. Because, for example, if you're sitting in church and something in a prayer just hits you funny and you're like, wait, why do we do that? Go look it up online. Understand that just by asking questions is not going to connect or disconnect you from God. God created you. God can handle the questions. God is way bigger than our human brains, thank goodness. So it's okay to ask the questions. If you have a community or you have maybe one person at church you think you can talk to about them, that's brilliant. And if all you have right now is a pen and some paper, put the questions down, because what happens is it helps move some funky energy through your body. And if you need to put the paper away and come back to it, you can. But at least you have been in a space where your body has heard you and you have told it, I know something isn't hitting right for you right now. And I don't have all the answers, but I respect you enough to write this down or go ask. And it's not always going to be, it's not a smooth sailing trip for anybody, maybe, but what you show yourself in that space is that you can depend on you to ask the questions that you need to ask. And that's incredibly empowering, especially in a religion where we're just fed lines and lines and lines and lines and lines. And we think finally having all the prayers memorized makes us great.
Yeah, and that creates a lot of issues as well sometimes. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes people, even, at least the examples that have been very close to me, is that people learn many things by heart. They kind of just know, and they can recite a lot of things. But when it comes to practice, when it comes to being connected to the practice or connected to this God, mm-hmm. it kind of doesn't really happen. So I love that idea, because it also helps people connect. Find that connection they're looking for and actually live it freely. I love that. And do you think for you, was there any specific challenge, any situation or anything that started to happen a lot that was very challenging and difficult for you to manage when you started looking for this better space to be in?
Okay, so I think every time someone asks me that question, I have a different answer. And I think it's because what it shows me is that there is a pattern. Pattern in my life telling me, Shannon, go find the next space. Shannon, go. I think it's wonderful when we get multiple kind of reaffirmations that looking for a third space is good. So what I will say, though, is that the event that's coming to mind right now. So Holy Thursday is a day in the week leading up to Easter. It's my favorite Mass of the year because people have to touch each other's feet and it's very vulnerable and people have feelings about it. And it's just so interesting to me to watch. And I love it. But I will say, so we're still in a pandemic. And Holy Thursday this past year was on it was in March or April. Like, some people have been vaccinated, a lot of people have not. So I went to Mass, not having incredibly great expectations, but just kind of wanting to see what the vibe was going to be like. I went People were very close together. I had my mask on. Lots of people did not. And then people asked if they could sit next to me, like right next to me. There was no space between us. These pews were packed. That made me uncomfortable. It did not make my body feel safe. Yes, we're in a pandemic. Yes, apparently we all believe in God, but also God knows the germs are here and is packing all of us on pews really the best thing for all of us. I'm not sure. And then Mass started, and we started with that prayer about bless me, Father, for I have sinned, or whatever. I could feel my immune system get depressed. Because on top of already not feeling safe, because so many of us were breathing on top of each other, I was now going to tell myself mentally, I'm a sinner, there's no hope for me, and I'm really sorry. I left because I was not going to do that to my body. I think God wants me to take care of my body, and I know that depressing myself and making myself feel bad does not help my immune system fight off a pandemic level virus. And that is one example of a time I was like, nope, this isn't it. This is not it. My body deserves better than this. And if the priests want to talk about us all having spirits, but don't want to understand that we also have bodies that need to be taken care of, then they need to do this differently. But this was not it.
I love it. Yeah, that's important. And I think you just used a very important example, because I think, have you seen how people have around the internet equated this whole pandemic and wearing a mask thing to wearing condoms and wearing them right, or even to like consent in itself?
Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it. Yes.
I find it's very similar in the sense that, because I've found myself in situations where it's difficult to tell this to people. I myself, I'm like you just described. If I go out, I'm going to have my mask on all the time, and I will try to stay away from people. And then sometimes people just don't even think about that at all. And then like there's just this uncomfortable moment sometimes where you're out, maybe with some friends, and then, they bring you some sauce to put to your food, but they don't divide it for all of you. Something like that. Or little things similar to that, where you kind of need to tell people, like, you really feel like you should tell them, can you please back off, or can you please put your mask on, you're serving my food.
Absolutely.
And it's just difficult to do. I think I love that example because it's also like a call, an invitation for people to really like, okay, what do you feel, and stand up for yourself, and make those decisions, because you know what you're feeling, and you're worthy of making actually those decisions, so you can actually be okay. So I thought that was an example, because it can be even harder if not, like this whole peer pressure on people. But we know that if we ask for these things, for example, if I ask the person to put the mask on while they're serving my food, I know that I'm going to be safe, and I'm going to eat that food happily, and I'm going to be fine.
And it's you just saying your needs and your boundaries. And again, similar to what we were talking about a little bit ago, like, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other person will respond the way you want them to, but you have done your part to stand up for your energy body. And that's what you can do. And
I think as long as you're not hurting anybody, I think that's a good indicator as well as of if the place you are in is a place you should be in, like if you communicate your needs, if you show what you need in any way, and this is just a reason for you to be wrong, most of the times that's probably a sign that you probably shouldn't be there. That's probably not your place.
Yeah,
that's true. Okay, so the question I would like to close with would be, there is this quote from a very interesting essay that compares religion with sex education. Well, in school specifically. And then the quote goes, it says, there is an increasing body of evidence to suggest that we need to think about religion in a different way, not as a process of training or indoctrination, but as arising from some deep seated instincts hardwired into our brains and then shaped by our cultures. This is more like the way we think about sex, emotions, and relationships. So my question for you would be, do you think that there are any major shifts needed in the way maybe the Western world or the American society conceives sexuality in relation to the spiritual practice or religiosity? What do we need to think about? Sorry, what do we need to change? Are there changes that we need to do in that regard?
All of it is energy. All of it is energy. So, and for me, I have an energy that makes me think about what created me and what my role is in this space-time continuum. There's also an energy in me that likes to use my body, that feels good when I orgasm, that wants to engage in very pleasurable experiences with another person or other people. And so when you take off the layers of, the traditions or the stigmas or the how to do's, and just look at it as this is energy moving through my body that makes me desire a relationship with God or sex, the two become a lot closer in what they're trying to do. These are desires we have that we want to use in healthy ways that are affirming, that feel good to us and feel good to the other people. And so for me, when I think about spirituality and sexuality on this line of energy, it's easy because all of it's just a desire. How do I do this in a way that uplifts me and that gives me sustenance for the journey?
I love that. I think that's a perfect closing line. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your thoughts. I hope that some of all this conversation resonated with somebody. Maybe you found some or a lot of the answers you're seeking for in your journey. And yeah, well, thank you so much for being here, and looking forward to maybe talking again sometime.
Yes, please. Thank you so much. I've loved this. It's been so fun.
Thank you.
Sex Talks with Diana is produced by My Sexual Biography, an educational platform meant to empower people like you to take command of your sexual story. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, and Spotify at My Sexual Biography. Visit our website and join our e-letter at mysexbio.org, and support our work by joining our Patreon. If you enjoyed this talk, please share it with a friend to continue the conversation. See you next time!